Grief 101. It's everywhere. But what do you do with it? Let's talk about it. Hello, Thunderhawk Coaching. Will here today. We're going to go over grief, how it's everywhere, and kind of maybe what we do about that. So I want to jump in with the definition to start with here. I have the Cambridge Dictionary definition right in front of me, and that's the one I'm going to use to define this. The top definition being grief, noun, sadness. So on the Cambridge Dictionary, it says, and I quote, very great sadness, especially at the death of someone who, for example, her grief at her son's death was terrible. Newspapers should not intrude on people's private grief. Grief-stricken newspaper pictures of grief-stricken relatives. She describes the anxieties and griefs caused by war. There's also some synonyms and antonyms of the definition of grief that I'm going to read here, which is going to point in the direction of how I'm going to discuss it today. So emotional pain is at the top, and I really like that. That's what I'm going to zoom in on a little bit. But pain, hurt, grief, heartache, heartbreak. Cool. So with the definitions cleared up from the Oxford Dictionary, how I'm going to be framing grief here is thinking about how prevalent grief is in all of our lives and what grief really is. So I'm going to start with the definition of grief. My definition of grief is the profound feeling of loss, and that can accompany sadness. That can be from death, but there can also be from times past. It can also be from experiences you're no longer having, certain needs no longer being met in a larger sense, and you can feel a degree of like nostalgia / grief for those time periods. I think grief can also be a little more complex, which is why I'm making a video about this, because I think we feel a grief about a lot of things, and I'm going to circle around some of those shortly. But first of all, I want to highlight that grief, the hardest part about grief is that it can be so indescribably intense and reality altering that it's really hard for us to emotionally engage with it willingly or readily. And I think a lot of us get paralyzed with what grief is and how we can even interact with it. So that's completely understandable. I think a big part of grief is kind of getting through the process, right? For those of you who are a little more grief literate, you've probably heard of the 7 stages of grief, which are different stages that outline how grief happens. So a little bit of a breakdown of that for those who don't know. We've got shock, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, testing, and acceptance. All of these phases, they're not linear, right? So you can come in and out of shock, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, testing, acceptance. And these come in waves. So when I think about grief, I think about the waves of grief. So a lot of people feel like we should be kind of over or get over people sometimes. That's something I've heard from clients, right? Why am I not over this grief yet? And that could be any kind of profound loss in my kind of definition of it. And that's because, in my opinion, when we take a grief wound, when we get hit with a profound sadness related to grief, that wound kind of stays there. So if you have this image of somebody's chest, right, and they get struck with a knife, and there's a big cut in their chest, that will heal. Okay, in some ways it will heal. You'll have the initial shock of the strike. If you're so shocked, you might even deny it kind of happened because it was such a big wound, and you might feel angry in response to receiving that wound. It doesn't 100% translate, but you kind of get the image. But when the wound heals up, I think we all assume the wound's kind of 100% normal and fine again. But when you have really deep wounds, for those of you who've had deep wounds of any kind, when you move, sometimes in certain ways those wounds reopen. And it's similar with emotional grief, where you get these waves of profound grief that kind of comes at you in really small ways. So, for instance, you could just be out, like, I'll show an example of myself, right? So my granddad, who's passed away, he loved gardening when he was alive, okay? So whenever I'm in a cabbage patch or carrots or some kind of root vegetable is being grown somewhat successfully, sometimes I'll get a little wave of grief, right? I'll get a sadness because I'll feel the loss of my granddad, right? Because my granddad loved to grow root vegetables, and I have fond memories of being sat in the garden watching him kind of pull up the weeds and water and take care of what he's growing. So I think something to make very clear here is, like, grief doesn't just go away. Grief is something that we have to work with and accept, right? And especially if you've gone through something traumatic and very grief heavy in the immediate instance, you will often be so shocked or in denial or anger. You'll be in those early phases of grief that it's actually inappropriate for you to even feel out what's going on. Okay, so to begin with, if you lose somebody you really care about, it's kind of inappropriate to be immediately in some kind of therapeutic service, in my opinion, because you can get really, really stuck in the rumination, the really intense feelings being really present. I think then you need family support or people around you or community support, and you can seek therapy, but it's also hard to really work towards a degree of acceptance when the wound's so fresh, right? Because to come back to the emotional wound analogy of losing somebody, there needs to be a certain amount of time that the bleeding needs to stop in the wound, right? It needs to start scabbing over before you can really apply the appropriate treatment to it to build a degree of acceptance and be able to move forward with life, right? And that comes with a little bit later in the phase. We were talking about testing, which is trying out new ways to cope and begin and figure out how to live in day-to-day life again, right? That's a lot of, in my opinion, where the role of therapy is, and coaching, mental health coaching, in my opinion, especially mental health coaching, is how do we cope with life post grief. And grief can show up in really small, intense ways. And I'm using, the wound analogy, and I'm using the loss of somebody as really really obvious examples, but I think there are some more nuanced examples we can also look at when I'm thinking about Grief 101. It's not just the loss of a loved one. It can also be the loss of an identity. So there can be a lot of grief in losing kind of your social value in your connection to something that feels really valuable and important to you. So it could be the loss of a relationship and the person's still alive. It could be the loss of a job. It can be the loss of a capability to fulfill a certain role, right? So if, for example, you were very strong, right, and you were good at lifting and carrying things. Let's say you worked on you were a tradesperson and you were a carpenter and you worked on a construction site, and you had a really bad accident, and you could no longer work on a construction site. You could no longer build things. There's a grief that comes with losing your ability to provide for the people you care about, for being able to feel like you have a reason to be here, right? It can get quite existential quite quickly. So grief isn't binary. Grief is not straightforward, I guess, is the one thing I want to put down in Grief 101. And understanding that the thing you need more than anything when we come close to what do you do with it, is you kind of need patience and compassion with yourself, right? So this is one of the reasons why support groups are really good, to have a group of people that are going to understand your grief, right? And in my opinion, grief has a lot of tendrils and a lot of mental health challenges and mental health conditions. A lot of research contributes to the idea that a lot of addiction is fueled somewhat by grief, because a profound wound happens and then addiction leads into I need to like manage this feeling, this profound sadness, this loss of a relationship, this loss of a life, this loss of a purpose. All of that can contribute to having this like lost, empty feeling that I think comes with grief, and that can lead into probably the depression kind of stage of grief. But I think it's quite consistent throughout a lot of the different experiences of grief, from what I've heard and what I personally experienced, and what the research also points at. So that's a little bit of how it's everywhere. Something I want to touch on here is like, what do you do with grief? In my opinion, one of the really helpful things to do with grief is to, and I think this is part of what historically has been quite effective in a lot of cultures, and probably is less prevalent now, certainly in my cultural reference, is that there were kind of like rituals historically that like celebrated the passing of life and celebrated the life ultimately, right? Something like, I don't know if it was an old Chinese proverb that I heard from a friend that was like, you know, when somebody passes away, they open the window to let the spirit out. And there were like these little traditions, these ways of thinking about the passing of somebody that created a degree of closure and acceptance with the event, right? So it might be, you know, in my frame of reference, talk about my granddad before. When he passed away, he was cremated, and then we scattered his ashes near where he grew up and spent his life, in the countryside. And for me, it was very cyclical. It was very, so he's returned from where he was, from where he spent his life, from where he felt connected. And for me, that allowed me to kind of be like, so like this is the end of this kind of experience, right? And I think that's why like funerals are actually really important for like grief, right? But we don't have like funerals for like the loss of a job or a divorce or the changing of capability in our lives. And I think in a lot of ways, that makes those types of grief harder, because I think it almost makes them feel like less important or less valuable and less able to feel and be with. So when like we're looking at grief and when we're thinking about like what to do with grief, is I think it's really important to sit with the memories and the connected feelings you get from what you lost. So it could be a really great friendship you had, and you're feeling the loss of that great friendship. Reflect and like reminisce on those experiences, right? I think when we have the initial shock, and this is super understandable, and you can be in that shock for a while, and the anger and the denial and the bargaining of what you could have done to reverse said loss, but ultimately really feeling through both sides of like, oh, it's terrible now that I don't have this, but also like how much I got out of it that time, and accepting that time has ended. Reflecting on what you really got out of those moments, I think is really important. But also like, it's not easy to do that, right? This is a process that starts with a big ball of emotion that we're going to kind of chip away at and make a little bit smaller. The core is never going to leave, right? But we're going to talk about it, we're going to feel a lot of it out, and we're going to feel a little bit lighter in the moment. And the container for said grief is going to expand as we better understand our emotions and better understand the waves of grief that come up. You know, I said I have an acceptance of my granddad's passing, but I still do feel, you know, waves of grief. I don't think they ever truly leave you, but I do think that if you incorporate some of the spirit and the values and the things that really kind of you took from those experiences or times or people, and carry that into your life now in one way or another, I think that's quite a healthy way of like honoring the experience or the memory or the role. So if you were the carpenter that lost his job because you physically no longer able to like make stuff at like an industrial level, maybe you as a hobby build something a little bit, or you teach people how to make things you no longer have the physical capabilities to make, or you enjoy and cherish the things you have made. You know, But ultimately, I think grief is a very delicate process. It's something that I want to make super clear in this video. If you are experiencing grief, do get support. You need to work with somebody, a support group, a therapist, a well-qualified mental health coach, because this stuff you can't do alone. I think that's something I want to make very clear. You cannot process grief alone. The ball will not move. Okay, so we talked about that ball of emotion. It won't be processed. It won't be understood fully, because when we try and process emotions internally, all we can do is put them in a box, but we cannot actually process them. Okay, so when we don't talk about emotions and keep them internal, it's kind of like a mist compounding, right? That we're trying to grab at a mist in our heads, and that mist can compound and compound and compound, and there can be less oxygen in that mist, and we can get, we can almost have our lungs filled up and suffocate almost. So please talk about it, because grief is one of the most intense emotions that we can experience as humans, in my opinion. And all kinds of grief are valid. So if you've lost a valuable friend, that's a painful type of grief. And if you can't accept that hurts, that's not going to stop being processed. So that's my little primer, Grief 101 from Thunderhawk Coaching here. If you like this video, please leave some comments. I'm happy to expand out and do a Grief 102. There's a lot I could say about grief, especially in relation to grief and nostalgia. But that's where I'm going to leave it for today. You've been wonderful. I've been Will. Good luck feeling what you gotta feel, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.